On this episode, I'd like to welcome back paranormal investigator, researcher, historian, and psychic. If you missed her first interview, please go back and check out episode 59, Paranormal Things and Cryptid Creatures. I'd like to welcome Stephanie Bingham back to the show. How you doing, Stephanie?
I'm great. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. Nice to have you. Thanks for joining us today. I know
Thanks
you're,
for having me back.
yeah, I know you're busy. But I guess what I'd like to start with is just maybe just how have things been for you since we last spoke. It's been a while. As far as like you're investigating and everything that's going on with you. What's been up?
So things naturally slowed down there for a little bit, something about a little pandemic in there, not a lot of getting out and doing too much, lots of like in-house research and going back to books and things like that. But in the last few months, I've been able to get out and go to a lot of places. So getting back into the swing of the actual investigations have been really nice. Just getting out of the house really and going and doing all the fun new things. So I've been looking at some of the stuff I was researching over COVID, looking at some of the cryptids and going to some of the locations where they were supposed to have been sighted and, things like that.
That's cool. Very cool. So again, you're back into the swing of things. And how did taking time maybe out and stepping back and just doing research and diving into books, how did that work out for you? Did it seem like it kind of fit, or it was something that was needed, or?
It felt very much like I was back in college again. I spent, 6 years in college going undergrad and grad school, and during that time, I literally spent, 7, 8 months of the year in classes reading books, and then those months of summer was when I would get out and do things, and it felt very much like I was getting back into that habit, which was really useful for me because you had all your ducks in a row before you went out doing something as opposed to saying, "Oh, shiny, let's go," which was really nice.
Yeah, that I could see that. That's cool. So I follow you on Instagram, and you drop some really cool pictures of like locations. I mean, are those um well, some of the places almost seem magical in the photos. It's pretty awesome. Where is
You're
that? Are
picking up
those,
on things there.
yeah, are those places that you actually visit? And
Mhm.
that's so
Everything
awesome.
that is on there are places that I have been. I never post them on the day that I'm there, but they are all actual places. Most recently, I have found some of the fairy lore, the Fae lore, and how that sort of crossed over to Appalachia. So lots of things that are very sort of magical in a very traditional sense. So good job.
Okay, so you just mentioned the Fae. You got to fill us in on the details. And for the listeners out there, we're gonna kind of be all over the place in this episode just because she's so knowledgeable in so many different areas. And I just love to learn things and to get you maybe your perspective and take on, your beliefs and some of the things that you've learned throughout history and your studies. The Fae. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the Fae, the way I sort of look at it, they are an inhuman spirit. So they were never a person, they were never people walking around, and they come from generally Celtic lands. That's sort of where you hear the Fae coming from. But where I'm from, Kentucky, sort of Appalachian areas, you get a lot of people that ancestors came across and brought the fairy lore with them. And when they brought that lore, suddenly people started reporting things that fell in line with what they were reporting back home. And it's almost like the creatures or the entities that were causing these experiences in Europe followed them over and have taken root here, but they're not quite the same as what you would find in Europe. So they've sort of adapted to the area. And I've been doing a lot of digging, going through and just looking at some of these odd reports. You're going to have everything from the fifale, the fairy lights, the will the wisps, if you will, that you will follow off and never follow a light in the woods. You know, uh, Summoning things. You're going to have the mushroom rings and how to summons and portals. And it's a very diverse and very large topic, which is really sort of hard to deal with. But most recently, one of my friends and I, we went down to Smoky Mountains because if you want to look into some really strange occurrences, that's a great place to do it. You can literally get a cabin out in the woods there, and like where we drove in was through Gatlinburg. So you drive in through this super metropolitan area, thousands of people everywhere you look, and suddenly you're in the park and it's an immediate shift. And it's not a shift like you're going to find, walking into a haunted house. That feels very distinct. A ghost around, especially a human spirit, has a very distinct feeling. Even a malevolent spirit in a building feels a certain way. You get out into the woods like that and you start feeling things that are territorial and things that are old, things that if you don't know what you're dealing with could feel very aggressive. So it's amazing what can happen in those places if you are respectful and know the rules and don't, intrude.
You mentioned lights in the woods, and that's fascinating to me because people that are in the woods that maybe take photographs of lights or they talk about it, or oftentimes I think even people that are like maybe out searching for like Sasquatch and stuff, they
Yeah.
they run across these lights in the woods. And that's like the first thing that comes to my mind is like, is it like a Fae or something? Is
Hmm.
that typically what's going on in the woods?
That is one of the very common things you hear in the woods. One of the things that I think people don't pay enough attention to is the woods around them. I grew up in the woods, so I'm very tuned to what it's being like out there. And my friend that I took with me also grew up in the woods. We both did. So we're very used to it. But you start talking to people who are reporting strange phenomena and how these phenomena will start with the woods getting quiet all around them and how that's not supposed to happen. But then I talk to people like my friend who grew up in the woods just like I did, and it happens all the time. When things go quiet in the woods, there's a predator. It's when things start moving again, you have to sort of worry about. But it's looking at those things like that, the quiet in the woods, the sounds that should be normal but are out of season. This bird song. The one that always gets me is people hearing bells in the woods. Oh, it's nothing. I just heard a bell. I just heard a whistle in the woods. That's not like that's not normal. Like there's something to that. I'm not saying go follow it, but like I think people try and overlook the little things and focus on the big things like the lights that they really can't explain.
That's interesting, and that's fascinating. You mentioned that how the woods goes quiet because I've been in the woods when that's happened a few times, and
Hmm.
it is an eerie feeling. But I think it's an interesting take that you say that it's not necessarily anything paranormal or strange, right?
It doesn't have to be, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be. I mean, there have been times in the woods when I've been walking around and you hear it go quiet. And if you look around, you're going to see the coyote, you're going to see the bobcat over there, no quiet. And there's been other times in the woods where I've heard it go quiet. And as that happened, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew there was nothing in my mind you could tell me at that point that there was not something paranormal going on in that moment. It was entirely odd. And those are the cases that I think could lend themselves to things like missing 411 or even a Bigfoot experience, depending on what you're looking at there. But I think people are too quick to say that it's paranormal because of the times that I've happened in the woods, for me at least, 9 out of 10 times, it has been a large predatory animal that is like, what are you doing here? As opposed to something else.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense the way that you just explained that. The Fae, do they have? I mean, I know I think they're kind of mischievous, but are they? Do they have like bad intentions towards humans, or is it just? Is there? Does it vary, or
From my experience and from what I have been able to dig up while reading, they're not people. They don't think like people. They have motivations of their own. So while they might not necessarily be aggressive or malicious or malevolent, that doesn't mean they're not going to be mean to you on that day. It also doesn't mean that the next day they might not help you. I think it's very hard to put human concepts into things that never were human and don't think like people. It's like with an animal. I love my cat to death. She will bite me. It's going to happen, but that doesn't mean she's evil. It just means that she's a cat. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah, it's a good explanation. Has there been any like maybe recent investigations that you've been on that maybe have surprised you or you've stumbled upon something interesting?
The last big investigation was the one we went down to the mountains, and that one we were specifically looking, not actually poking, just looking to see what the area was to sort of feel it out for later investigations, what we were doing. And you get out there, you have your intent. You're going to state, we're talking about fairies while we're out there. We're talking about what we're looking into and what we're talking about, but inside the hotel, inside where we're staying at. And then we're walking back because, you're going to go wandering around dark because, it's what you're going to do in the woods. So we're out walking back and you just see fog rolling in, like a very strange sort of fog. And it's one of those times where you're like, and this is no longer a place for us to be. And we went inside, left the car parked out front, locked the door, and we're like, we're done for the day. Whatever's going on out there is not meant for us. We went back inside, and then the next day we went out to the car, and there was a dried pressed rose left outside the car door. Nothing else, no footprints, no nothing, just that. And that's one of the things that is just stuck with me since it's happened. It's been several weeks now, and I'm just very stuck on this occurrence, and I can't quite put all the puzzle pieces together. Something there. I'm gonna have to go back is the only answer.
And can you was it what do you think it was? I mean, obviously you're saying that you kind of don't know what it was, but
Mhm.
uh maybe perhaps something symbolic or something.
I think that it probably was a symbol of something. You have a lot of symbology rather with flowers from most cultures that also deals with something that I'm writing right now, has to do with flowers in particular. So I found that to be very personally significant. But the fact that it was a dried rose that had been fully dried, fully cured, we picked it up, we took it home with us, which I do not suggest picking up things that may or may not be gifts or offerings from things. Do as I say, not as I do, really. don't don't follow my example on that, but I had to. And sometimes you get into situations like that where all the rules, all the logic tells you don't do this, but something inside says no, this is a thing and you need it. So I took it and I've been puzzling over it, looking for things about it to try and give it more context, but right now the answer is I really don't know, and my only options are something in the woods left a flower, and we were out there looking for fairies. So not a good answer, I know, but that's what I have.
Now, when you're in the woods doing these investigations, do you like pick up on things psychically?
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
depends on where we're looking and what we're looking for. I get into a lot of issues in the woods specifically, especially in the mountains, because they were so heavily populated for so very long. So the places that people know tell you to go for strange activity are almost always old homesteads. And old homesteads, in addition to having whatever inhuman things might be there, also are going to have the human residents, the people that are still with their houses. And that gets very sort of dicey for me to pick out, especially if I'm looking for one thing or the other. What is the ghost and what is the other? So it's trying to pick out which ones is which out there. And that gets very odd. But I think people also forget that areas, especially areas with that sort of history, have their own sort of energy to them. Like if you've ever been to New Orleans, that's like the best city I've ever thought of to explain it. Like when you get to New Orleans, it feels different than any other city in the US. It feels distinct and apart from everything around it.
Man, I
And
need to go.
it's fantastic. I cannot suggest you go enough. It is a wonderful place, especially if you're trying to learn to feel energies. There's so much moving and melding there, and so many cultures and so much magic really in the area that it's very interesting to sort of feel and poke and immerse yourself in it. But I found something very similar to that up in the mountains recently. It had almost a spirit of its own. And it's not to say that it was a ghost of the area, but I feel like if you were quiet and if you listened, it could lead you to something. If that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, that's odd. That's
Yeah, it
odd.
was really strange.
Um, you mentioned off air that you're in another book. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I have a new book I'm being part of. It's The Feminine Macabre, which is a Journal of Paranormal Articles written by females. This is volume 4 coming out, and I wrote about the dancing lady is what they call it around here. It is a story that took place in Kentucky. We used to have a lot of sulfur springs and hot springs, and they were a place where you'd build a hotel and you would go there for medicinal reasons. And some of them were actually like for treating tuberculosis and things like that. But this one in particular was essentially a hangout for the rich and famous. It was where you'd go to have vacation. And one summer evening, a lady went to the dance there. She had a room at the hotel, went down to the ball, was dancing the night away, and died in her partner's arms. She had checked in under the name and given her father's name, essentially, as a judge in Louisville. And he was not her father. He did not have a daughter. So nobody knew who this woman was. And they essentially cared for her body for about 2 weeks before they buried her on the grounds of the hotel by herself. And they put a little plaque above it, which is still there, which says, hushed and hallowed be the places of the dead. And that's all it is. It's a grave with that sign. And eventually the hotel was torn down. It burned down several times. It was a hospital for a while. Very odd area with a very detailed history of just strange occurrences. But now it's a large like children's playground, and right next to the parking area is this one grave that sits by itself. In and of itself, a very odd story. But almost from the time that the first fire happened, which took down the original hotel, people have been reporting seeing a woman by the grave dancing or singing. And she would call out to people crying because she wanted to get back to the hotel. And when they would tell her that the hotel was gone, she would disappear. So you have this ghost that is haunting the area, trying to get back to where she died at. It's a very odd story, and they are currently trying to get permits to exhume her body to see if they can get DNA and figure out who she might have been, or even if there is anyone in the grave. There is a faction in sort of small town Kentucky that is like, did she exist? Is there anyone there? Or was this just for publicity? So there's a lot going on with that, and it's a very interesting story, and also next to one of the oldest settlements in the state. So it's next to a very, very, very early American fort, like 2 blocks away. It's a strange, strange thing.
Wow. What is your take on, I'm going to go a little bit beyond this question once I ask you this question, but because I want to get your view on the afterlife and what we're really doing here. But what is your take on, like, you mentioned that she's seen, is that like perhaps just recorded energy from when she lived her life, or is it, I mean, she's not back, or is she like back from the dead, just kind of manifesting her energy to show herself, or what's going on?
In my opinion, she is not a residual spirit, and the residual ones are the ones that I think are just recordings of energy. They repeat the same thing, often going upstairs, often a moment of great joy, great sorrow, whatever it happens to be. And you repeat a 20, 30-second loop, and it'll happen generally around the same time. This one seems to have at least some sentience of the things that are happening around her. She is able to speak to people and acknowledge that they exist also, which I found to be very unique with ghosts. And really, it's only the sentient spirits that are aware that we are here as well. But the thing about her is, she had been dead for several years before she was first seen as a spirit. The story had been circulating in town. People were thinking about it. People were directing their living energy towards this grave. And I always wonder if that did not give her enough energy to manifest herself to those who knew the story and knew what was happening in the area. And I think that that's something that happens with a lot of haunted locations. I mean, they are haunted to begin with, but take a place like Waverly Hills, incredibly haunted location. But now we are sending people through it that are looking for ghosts, that are going through a haunted house. That is a lot of energy focused on the paranormal and just being scared. And that is a lot of fuel for paranormal encounters. So are we inviting things that want to feed off that energy to manifest for us, to sort of create a loop of food for them, if you will?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially with as many people that travel there now to
Mhm.
visit it. But even perhaps even just the collective consciousness of everybody that knows or is into the paranormal talking about it and speaking of it and thinking of it. I don't know if that would provide any kind of energy towards it, but it's just interesting.
Absolutely, and what you're talking about, a tulpa, gets very sort of interesting when you start looking at it. The one time that I believe I encountered a tulpa or an egregore was actually at college. It was in a college dorm, and I got called by a sorority, of all things, to come in and take a look at their floor in the dorm. I lived in the same building with them, and they were having all of this weird occurrences. They had these stories that they would tell the new sisters, and after several years, it seemed like these stories started happening, and they wanted it gone. And they basically got to the point where it got just over the top for them and they were done with it. But they kept telling these stories and eventually it started happening. And it was, just your normal average haunting. It was a thing that would walk down, scrape its nails on the sides, nothing really that intense, but it had been built up enough that they had created it. Because when you go to interact with a spirit like that, I expect them, if it's interacting with the world around it, it can see it, it can interact, it knows it's there. This thing had no real consciousness of what was around it. It was a very odd day.
I often wonder that with cryptid creatures and even perhaps
Hmm.
UFOs and aliens, if we're not feeding it or giving it more than it could have. That's interesting.
Absolutely. Especially the stranger cryptids, the squonk and things like that.
Yeah.
Are we just giving manifestation to our own fears and thoughts like that? But the thing I come back to with the fairies and the aliens specifically are we seeing two phenomena there, or are we seeing one?
I have a question about that coming up, and yeah,
Okay,
then
good.
and that's really I do want to talk a lot about that because
Yeah.
I think oftentimes a lot of that. I mean, I don't know, but I've heard people mention how a lot of it is kind of one and the same in that, especially like with even like Sasquatch and then UFO sightings being in the same general area or even around the same time frame. Like, it's almost as if it's linked or connected, or perhaps it's all just one phenomenon that I don't know. It's just it's baffling. But I do
Yes.
want to talk about that. Um, so you know, us as humans, as people, we live life, and if we live long enough, we experience loss. And just here recently, I've had a few friends and some coworkers pass away, so it had me thinking, like, what you know, what happens to us when we go? What happens to us when we die? And you being connected the way that you are, and especially psychically, what is your take on perhaps, what is your take on the afterlife?
From what I have been able to ascertain, when you die and you are not caught in that loop of trauma, like there was a wreck that happened recently near work, and there is someone still sort of caught in that moment of death. But even in a short period of time that that's happened, I can see that entity fading. And that seems to be the way that I've seen it go. If you're caught in a moment of tragedy, you stay there until you come to terms with the fact that you are dead. And then what seems to happen is they go back to what made them happy, a place, more often than not, people. They go back to see their family. They go back and they wait for their people to join them where they are. And I personally believe that there is reincarnation. I have had some issues with being able to read Egyptian hieroglyphs in, second grade. Things like that aren't quite normal, but that's the way I see it. I believe in soul families to an extent, and I think that you go back and you wait for your people, and then you will decide as a group to stay or to come back as time wills it.
That's good. So then what is your idea of all of this 3D dimensional space reality that's actually just all empty space, at least according to science it is, um,
Yeah.
which that's, I guess, you know, is what it is. What is your take on it? I mean, are we here, is this all perhaps fabricated and created to just have experience?
I don't know fabricated and created for that, but I do think it is used for it. I think it's a way for people, for souls, for energy to manifest itself and experience things that cannot be experienced on the other side. Be that learn lessons, feel emotions, whatever that happens to be. I feel like this is a place to get out the things that you cannot do on the other side.
Yeah, yeah. I think you might be onto something there. So, all right, I'm gonna start getting weird. Um,
Okay.
there, so I've got a lot of questions about cryptids, about perhaps a lot of this being one and the same. So I had an interview yesterday, and I was talking to a guy, and he brought up a cryptid that I had never even heard of. So I had to do a little bit of research today to see what it was, and perhaps you may have heard of this. The Manus Man of Hackettstown, New Jersey. Do you know anything about this?
I do not know that particular story. I have been dealing with some mantis man encounters with people reporting them basically, but not that particular mantis man.
So what are they reporting? Talk to us. What's this Manus thing?
So the mantis, from the people that I have heard about it from, is by their description an alien. It is a it is just the manifestation that this alien has chosen to take, and it looks like a giant praying mantis, like person-sized praying mantis, which frankly nightmare fuel in my mind. But they also report that these things aren't, praying mantises. They are green or they are brown, like an actual praying mantis. You're dealing with that unless you're the fancy ones and then they're pink or something. But they're talking about them being like pink or purple or orange, like strange colored things that seem to have some sort of telepathic way of communicating with people, specifically telling them, don't be afraid of me, which is asking a lot for a person. I mean, look at what a praying mantis does in its tiny size. They are predators. They will eat birds. Like these are aggressive little things. And having this form in that size is very odd. And I can't help but wonder if we're dealing with things that are just trying to make themselves look like something, because I can't wrap my brain around a planet or another dimension where a praying mantis of that size is running around. That just does not compute in my brain.
Yeah, yeah, and that's like when he was explaining it. That's kind of what I thought too. Was like, well, maybe they're aliens because I've heard people talk about alien like Manus type creatures,
Hmm.
but this thing is like 8 foot tall, like kind of like what you're talking about, but it's seen in the woods and it just in that area. There's been like
Hmm.
a few reports of it. Just interesting. And I like your take on, perhaps it's something just manifesting the image of a manus, and it's not really. I mean, because I think maybe a lot of this of what's going on is that I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I could see the argument. Like, if you're coming from somewhere completely other, you're not going to turn yourself into a spider. Too many people are afraid of spiders, but nobody's going to walk up to you and say, "I'm terrified of praying mantises." Like, it's not a common fear to have. So maybe the logic there is people aren't afraid of these things, so we should look like one. You could argue it. I just have a hard time with the image of a giant praying mantis. Like, that's just terrifying to me.
Yeah, that is terrifying. Your thoughts on Dogman?
Oh, that's a deep hole. Uh, I I have thoughts on Dogman. I really do. There's so many tales of werewolves that I think that you are dealing with at the very least a tulpa of werewolves running around, at least in certain areas. I think I have a hard time with the idea of a shape shifting, something that actually goes from human to a wolf as a physical being. Are we talking about something else? The dogman in particular, there's actually several reports of dogmen down in the area that we were at in the mountains. Like that is a thing. And we're in the mountains, so you're going to go see a bear. specifically going to go see a bear at a little zoo just to, say you saw the bear at the mountains. And I remember walking in specifically with my friend and seeing this bear that was semi acclimatized to people. It's used to people being around it. And just looking at the shape of it, this big furry ruff around its head, this slim body. It doesn't have a tail, but shy of that, it had the perfect physique of a dogman, which I found to be sort of odd because you hear dogman, being huge with this tail and they're going to be highly aggressive, which bears can be. So that got me to thinking of, are dogmans just misidentified bears? Which I don't like the misidentification as most explanations for pretty much any cryptid because there's too many people seeing them. And bears aren't nearly widespread enough, but I kind of wonder if we're not dealing with something that is adjacent. And that gets into the problem. Sorry, I'm getting down really weird into a rabbit hole here, but I've heard reports of dogmen that were disincorporate, that did not have physical forms, were able to disappear basically and do things like you'd expect a ghost to do. So
Sasquatch gets a lot of those reports as well.
they absolutely do. But I have a hard time with a Sasquatch and a dogman because I've heard the argument that Sasquatch and dogmen are the same thing, but they
No,
are.
they're
I
not.
agree. Like they're not. That doesn't make sense with the reports and with the actions of them.
Yeah, exactly. Because at least with the
It's
stories
the
of
aggressive.
Dogman, yeah, they're very aggressive from what I heard. And you're right. There is some reports in Kentucky
Hmm.
of Dogman, and that's interesting.
Exactly.
The problem I have
And
too with the
yeah,
misidentification thing is just that a lot of times these are like avid woods people that are in the woods all the time that know
exactly.
what animals look like. They know their environment, they know their area. Um, there's
Exactly. But isn't it something to say there that if you were going to be something that was going to be trolling the woods and you don't want to be found, what if there is something nearby that is close enough to make somebody look crazy? You know what I mean? It's that was the thought that I kept coming back to is what if it was intentionally in these areas where there are things that are close enough if you tilt your head the right way to explain that away to most people, you know?
yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Huh. Fascinating.
Sorry, that's been on my brain a lot lately.
No, that's good. You're giving me some things to think about here. Uh, what do you know about the Jersey Devil?
Uh, Very old story. Mother Leeds, 13th child. She cursed him because it was the 13th child. Some say the child was born a perfectly healthy baby and then almost instantaneously essentially bit a midwife. And when it emerged from the blanket, emerged with cloven hooves and little wings and, a misshapen face and flew up the chimney and has been reported in the woods of Jersey ever since. Uh, I do not put much stock in that origin story. But you have this idea of this horse-headed creature prowling the woods in New Jersey that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years at this point with thousands of reports. That has to lead to something. And of course, people will tell you, oh, it's a crane. Same thing as the explanation they'll give you for a Mothman. It's a crane. They can't all be cranes, guys. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And it's still seen today, right? In that
It
area.
is, yes.
Yeah. And it's strange
The
that it's just in that one area.
It is, but when you think about the size of the Pine Barrens, they're huge and they're not very settled. And what I come back to with the Pine Barrens in specific is that people have tried to settle the Pine Barrens, have tried to clear them, to farm them for centuries, and it doesn't take. They've tried and tried and tried, and it never seems to take. And it's very odd that you'd have land in, the US that is like that, you know, one would think you could develop into something that is just sitting there, nothing.
Right. Okay. So the link between some of these cryptids, such as Bigfoot, even Mothman with like UFOs, alien encounters and stuff, has me wondering, and I've heard other people mention this, it wasn't my thought, I'm not the, originator of this thought, but just that perhaps we're dealing with something that's one and the same, or something that's really similar or connected in some way. Um, I don't know if you elaborate on that for me, please.
I've heard the same thing, that there is connections between pretty much all paranormal things, up to and including ghosts and like your UFO phenomena. I don't think they are one and the same exactly. I think you can make a very good case for fairy encounters today, or fairy encounters of the past, and UFO encounters of today being one and the same actual phenomena, explained through the lens of the time that they are in. Like, I think if you go back, especially if you look at the fairy abductions taken back to a place that they don't know, these tall, thin beings, people don't realize there are fairy abductions that people talk about, but there were a lot of fairy
Yeah, I
abductions that
had
people
no
talk
idea.
about.
That's interesting.
Exactly. But they had the same sort of plot line. You get abducted, you get taken to, then it was under the hill, under the ground, and you're examined by these tall, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrifying creatures. And then sometimes you're brought back, and sometimes you just poofed. And you look at the UFO abductions, especially like the Betty Barney Hill abduction, things like that, and they seem to follow the exact same plot almost. So I think you can make a very good argument for the two of them being connected. As far as the other things go, the cryptids, the UFO encounters, the Bigfoots, all that happens in the same area, I am more likely to believe that there is some sort of paranormal flap going on in a location, that there is something so off about the energy, or that perhaps these things manifesting in there is causing an energy that is either drawing out or giving energy for other things to manifest around it. So I don't think they're necessarily causing it, but I think that they are leading to it, if that makes sense.
Now, is it perhaps that all this is kind of maybe not purposefully done, or perhaps purposefully done, but do you think that it's human consciousness that's driving these things and perhaps even creating a lot of this stuff?
I think that argument can be made. Um, I don't know if I believe that humans have the capacity to create so many different things. I mean, we are a remarkable species, but the idea that we are the only species out there that can create such things is nonsensical to me. So I think while we might create a lot of them, I think we have to give strong credence to the idea that at least something else is creating at least some of what we're seeing.
Now, these things that are, you know, a creation of something else, I mean, do you believe that they originate kind of the same source or same place that we came from? Like, as humans, as energy, not necessarily as humans, but like as energy, is like, because when you break it down, like we're not really flesh and blood. We're just kind of like in a meat suit, I think, anyway.
Exactly.
So I
We
mean,
are ghost running meat suits.
so are these
Hmm.
things basically the same thing, or are they something entirely different? Or
I think that when it gets down to most things, you're dealing with at the core level energy. So I think that most things will come down to a core of energy, but I also believe that there are certain things that don't need a form to manifest. Be it a spirit, be it a jinn, however you want to look at it. The smokeless fire of the jinn, specifically that imagery, has always reminded me, the heat off a road in the summer, energy being released, that sort of thing. Are these just things that are energy that need forms to interact with the physical world as we know it? And I think that that is going to be true for a lot of things, that they don't need what we need to interact with the world around us.
okay, aliens, are
Yep.
are they are they do you see, I always originally I thought like aliens are just like creatures from another galaxy or something, and they come down here, but now I'm starting to wonder if they're more like cryptid type creatures, and that, you know what are your thoughts on that?
So again, I go back to the size of the universe and how I think it is ridiculous of us to think that we are the only ones here. I I realize that science does not back this up. I understand that, but I kind of wonder if there's not something out there, probably not a lot of them, but something out there that has figured out how to travel at least some distance. Perhaps not all the way to here, although I kind of think that you may have seen a actual physical craft occasionally here. I think more often than not, specifically with aliens, you're dealing with things from dimensionality. So something from another dimension more so than another planet. But I don't like to neglect the fact that there might be things from other planets, although not nearly as common as the other.
Yeah, I think I buy more into that they're dimensional beings that can
Hmm.
travel in and out of our dimension.
Yes.
Uh, and perhaps they are, if they're not like cryptids, perhaps they are more spiritually evolved and even technologically evolved than we are.
And I could see that. But you could make the same argument for cryptids being able to be interdimensional beings as well. Especially you hear that with the mantis men, because if you're calling them an alien, but you're saying interdimensional, are we just not, you know what I mean? Like, are these two separate entities? Are they the same kind of entity? And that would explain why certain things like a Bigfoot might not be seen all of the time in certain places. But it's a lot of gray area there, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And perhaps when, as humans never know the answer.
Mm.
I'm not sure. Um, do you do any kind of are you into conspiracy theories at all?
I find that conspiracy theories are oftentimes unfeasible in my mind, especially
Mm,
the ones that require people to lie, large groups of people to lie and keep up a lie.
right, right. So
So
what's your take on Antarctica then?
on Antarctica as a
As just not being
UFO
able.
base, like I've
Y-
heard lots of ones
Yeah,
about
yeah,
Antarctica.
exactly. Just there's all
Yeah,
kinds of stuff out there about
exactly.
Antarctica.
Mhm.
Exactly. So do you have any thoughts? Is it just all rubbish? Which
If you wanted to hide something, Antarctica would be the perfect place to do it. But on the same coin, that is one of the most inhospitable areas in the world. Now, if you want to argue that there are aliens or some sort of cryptid like creature living on or below Antarctica, I think you have a much better chance of arguing that than arguing that there's a government conspiracy happening in Antarctica. You know what I mean? Like, there's room for one in my brain, but I don't see how enough people can lie and keep up a lie for the other to be true, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. And you had mentioned perhaps under Antarctica. That just brings me to a thought of, and I'm sorry if I'm all over the place here, but how some like UFO crafts and stuff have been seen like going into our oceans and then
Yeah,
coming out of our oceans. And it makes me wonder, like, perhaps there is aliens that are like that live here on Earth or that are among us or that, I don't know.
absolutely. USOs. I think that that is a fascinating idea. And what I come back to with the reports specifically of the USOs, the crafts going underwater, there's lots of reports of sunken civilizations. There are lots of reports of mermaids from around the world. Who's to say that we're not looking at the same phenomena they were and giving it a different explanation? Um, there's so much unexplored in the waters that absolutely anything could be hiding down there. I mean, we don't know what's in the depths of the ocean. We really don't. But if you're seeing a UFO going into the water, is that a city sinking? If you see an alien swimming through the waters, is that a mermaid? You know, like
Yeah. Yeah. It's valid. Um, and so just trying to collect my thought here. Sorry.
no,
Um,
you're good.
these aliens,
Hmm.
I mean, if they are in our ocean, I guess they could be physical or non-physical or still interdimensional. It's
Hmm.
strange to me that like with the government now getting on board with the UAP thing, and
Hmm.
it seems to be, at least in the national media, that there's more sightings now. But I mean, I suppose with technology and stuff, perhaps they're just catching more on camera and stuff like that. And maybe it's always been, and it's
Hmm.
not increased, but it seems to me like perhaps there's an increase. What's your take?
I think it's going to be like ghosts. You hear a lot more ghost sightings today than you did 300 years ago, but also at that point you could burn at the stake for it. If you reported seeing a UFO in the 1940s, you could be put in an asylum. Today, you are going to get some views online for it. You know what I mean? And I think that change in society has allowed people who are experiencing things all over the world to be open about it. Also, a lot more hoaxes now, but when it is okay, you're going to talk about it because it is interesting. It's something the human mind loves a mystery, or a perfect mystery that we don't have any answers to. So, and it's one that science will almost agree with you on being true. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Why do you think the government, and I'm not trying to get into conspiracies because you'd mentioned that it's not really your thing. But why do you think the government is so forthcoming all of a sudden with some of this stuff?
Specifically with the aliens, I think that
Yeah.
you are dealing with a lot of scientists that are basically saying the math shows this. The math shows that there are other intelligent beings somewhere in the universe. And as soon as it's accepted by science, I mean, there's only so much you can deny as a government at that point before science starts tearing down all of your lies and pointing out where they are wrong. So I think that actual proof, if you will, from the math of the science is lending to the government being like, well, we can't. But also, you have the simple fact that they were able to see what happened. When scientists first started coming out saying that the math shows there's aliens out there, people did not lose their minds. There was no mass hysteria, there was no mass panic. So if in the 1950s and 60s they were worried about a panic due to aliens, they were able to see in that moment that there was no panic. We really didn't care, except for us weirdos that were watching it saying, yes, finally, you know.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right about that. There's not going to be a panic. I think too, perhaps um our our culture nowadays is also kind of conditioned everybody just with all the movies and all the books and just everything, that it it is what it is.
Absolutely. And you expect them at this point. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at pretty much any media, aliens are a valid answer to pretty much any show at this point. So, you know.
Speaking of that, just real
Hmm.
quick, um shows in general on
Yeah.
TV. What's your take on what's going on at Skinwalker Ranch? Is I'm sorry,
Um,
you're like cracking up over here. I'm sorry. I just
no, you're good. You're good. Uh, Skinwalkers have been coming up a lot lately. I think the original Skinwalker Ranch story, the family that owned Skinwalker Ranch bought it where the dog showed up, the wolf showed up the very first day, attacked the cow, that whole thing. That is a story that I find extraordinarily believable. The experiences that they reported during that time. As to what has happened since then and what is now being reported there, I don't know. It's one of those things where it's like there was this very believable phenomena that was reported that was happening, that you're going to do investigations of. Great. You start investigating and things start going super crazy. So you've either stepped in some sort of hornet's nest or something else is going on there. And we are using this story as a way of publicity or a way to cover something else. It's it's very odd, but I think that the experiences of skinwalkers in general, especially the ones that are coming out now, are fascinating. They do follow along with the traditional tales of skinwalkers in that area that have been reported for thousands of years. So I think we have two distinct phenomena going on there, and it's one of those places where you don't want to say you would love to go there, but it's one of the places that I'd be like, yeah, sign me up, let's go right now. You know,
Yeah. Yeah. I think it would be cool. Um, with all this talk, I think I might know where this goes, but there's a lot of people that talk about how, well, there's a theory out there anyway that perhaps the aliens are kind of responsible for maybe changing the DNA of humans and kind of helping us to evolve in such a way. Uh, what is your take on that? Do you think it's nonsense or?
I think it is a fascinating theory. I think it takes away from some of the agency of humans. I think people don't like to think of ancient peoples as being as inquisitive and as smart and as intelligent as I believe they were. Do I think that an alien may have been responsible for inspiring the fact that we have pyramids all around the world? I could see that argument. Do I think they built the pyramids, or do I think that they sent down one of their representatives to breed to do it? Not necessarily. Um, just my personal opinion.
Yeah, I get that. That's a good answer. You're pretty, even though despite we're talking about some really strange, weird things, I think you're very grounded on all your views and thoughts of everything. So it's pretty cool.
Grad school will do that to you.
Yeah, it will. And I'm sorry for the like kind of jumping
No, you're good.
everywhere, but like I told you, before, I don't get to interview too many people that have such a wide knowledge base on different things. And it's just fascinating because I just want to know the answers to everything. Not that I'm ever going to find
Yeah,
answers out to anything, but it's cool to talk
it's
about.
always fun to poke the mysteries.
Yeah, it really is. Um, thank you again for taking the time out to do this tonight. What do you have as far as what's in your future plans as far as investigating or any kind of more written work, or what do you got going on?
Couple of investigations coming up. They're all private, and they are going into one of the pieces we're working on writing. We are doing some investigation looking at the origins of some odd occurrences, lizard men in the Ohio River Valley specifically. There's a lot of reports of it, and I find it very fascinating. Doing that, we're doing some more with the fairies because, of course, no release dates on any of that yet. Then I have the Cinema Cop coming out later this year. So that'll be very exciting. And everything else that's happening, I can't talk about.
I'm definitely interested in the lizard men in Ohio River Valley. I mean, you're talking about my neck of the woods there. That's interesting.
Exactly.
And I've never even didn't even realize there was lizard men sightings in Ohio.
There
That's
have been lizard man sightings in the area going back at least 250 years that I have found documentation for.
that
And
is
we're talking about
insane.
4 different types of lizard men in the area.
And when you say lizard men, you mean like straight up walking lizards that are
So
the
there's
size
the
of a
upright
man.
walking lizards, the size of men. There are the oversized, like 12-foot long lizard running lizards. You have the semi-aquatic things that appear more frog-like or amphibian, if you will. And then you have the very short ones, the Kelly goblins, the other goblins. All of them, if you look at the actual appearance of, you are dealing with lizard or reptilian type creatures. So those are the 4 types of lizard people we are looking at right now.
That's so cool. So cool. Awesome. I can't wait. Good.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to dive into that. That's fascinating. I got a note here that I gotta research Ohio lizardmen. That's cool. Um,
Absolutely.
so where can the listeners find you, check your work out, and then perhaps pick up the book that you're in the near future?
Absolutely. The book will be on Amazon. Feel free to check it out there, or you can go to spookeats.com, I believe, to find. you want to get a hold of me, best place is on my Instagram. The handle is Amarna Marie, which is AMARNAMARIE. I post pictures of my investigations there and the weird places I go and the cute animals I see because that's what I do. But if you have any questions, shoot them to me over there. I'm always willing to talk about anything weird or strange over there. So
Awesome. Thanks again for being on the show.
absolutely. Thanks for having me.